Okay, great. So the first thing that I'm going to do is put this paper in a little bit of context, this paper on oppression about in a little bit of context. And the way that I'm going to do it is kind of give a very brief review of what we were doing mainly with the ethical theories just in this past module period. I'm going to talk about sort of some approaches, two different approaches take with those kinds of theories, and how you can essentially use those theories, treat those theories as a tool, if you will. I don't know if everybody remembers, but the name of the textbook is 21st Century Ethical Toolbox, right? So taking some of the tools that you've learned in the past few module periods and use them to talk about some of the moral issues that come up surrounding oppression. So that's essentially what I mean here when I like give our little itinerary for today, when I'm saying like, where are we in this class? Where are we going next? So it's about like, all right, so here's some of the, let's like acknowledge this tool thing that the gathering of these tools, and then sort of starting to wrap our heads around how to use those tools to analyze moral issues, and specifically moral issues related to oppression. Okay, so this is something that I have touched on in the past, and it's something that the textbook has talked about a little bit, and it's this thing that happens so often in philosophy where there's an approach where different theories are treated as if they're in tension with one another. So, the way that like this comes up is perhaps like different judgments that maybe somebody like Kant would draw around whether or not we should be paying attention to the consequences of our actions, or whether we should be focusing on the inherent value of humans and sort of coming up with universal moral principles to determine what we should do. So one place where we see those two kinds of views in tension with one another is the discussion that we saw around the trolley example, right? So just as a refresher, by the trolley example, I'm talking about those instances where, or that case where, you know, you could move the trolley to save the 5 people but kill 1 person, or let the trolley continue and kill 5 people. And then the additional case that we saw where you have, you know, according to the consequentialist logic, you'd treat it the same way, right? Like a consequentialist, as you all have talked about at this point, would argue that in the case with the doctor and harvesting the organs, right, just as we would save the 5 people by redirecting the trolley, in the case where you have a doctor with 5 sick patients, 1 healthy person, the standard sort of utilitarian logic there would seem to tell us that what the doctor should do in that case, just as we saved the 5 people with the trolley, the doctor should kill that one healthy person in order to save the 5 sick people. And that kind of transition from like what Kant would essentially say there is like, look, you did the trolley example wrong, right? Because if we're using that logic consistently, then we would end up in these instances where you are using someone as a means to an end, purely as a means to an end. completely ignoring, that special quality about them, that ability to exercise reason. Now, if the doctor asks the person, do you want to sacrifice your life in order to save these 5 people? The person made a decision to do that, right? That would be an entirely different story. But in cases like that, we see, or rather, philosophers often look at those kinds of examples, have those kinds of debates to say, hey, no, this, that's it. Like I identify fully as a Kantian now. This should be like our strict guideline for all of our moral decision making, and like use this formula or this approach or this theory and only this theory. Like we've determined that this one is right. Or, somebody who feels like the utilitarians actually got it right, like says, well, oh, nope, that's it. I'm a utilitarian. We should be focusing on the consequences of our actions. Don't give me any of this universal moral principle crap. Like, this is how I identify now. This is going to be my guideline for all of my moral decision making. And that kind of approach to ethics is one that inherently inherently takes different views, different ethical theories as existing in tension with one another, and looks at the sort of weak points in those theories and says, well, in light of this problem, we should be throwing the entire theory out. Now, if you recall, after I discussed each ethical theory, right? So we did respect for persons, we did the ethics of happiness, we did the ethics of virtue, we did the ethics of relationship, right? And after I went through all of those, at the end of all of those lectures, we were talking about the different sort of shortcomings of each theoretical approach. I emphasized that yes, this is a problem for the theory. And it's something that, if somebody is saying, well, I want to be a utilitarian now, or I want to be a Kantian now. Those are the kinds of questions those issues are issues that that person is going to need to take seriously. And that is something that happens, like, taking the whole thing on board, saying this theory and only this theory, this theory that exists in tension with all of these other theories. That's one approach to ethics. This is my very long-winded way of explaining this little box here, where there's this assumption coming out the gate, being like, all right, how are we going to make our moral decisions here? And having this assumption that, okay, I can only pick one theory, and then I'm going to use that theory to explain everything. And I'm going to talk about how all the other theories are wrong because of all these different issues I bring up. That's one approach to ethics. And that is not the approach to ethics that we've generally been taking in this class. In this class, we've looked at different theories and been like, oh, hey, wow, respect for persons, not treating someone as merely a means, always sort of like respecting humans as ends in themselves, does some good work in explaining stuff. A lot of you talked about the good work that various theories do on your module worksheets. And pretty much everyone talked about some of the good work that these theories do on the midterm as well. So what I've been trying to sort of teach throughout the term is that, yes, there are these 2 approaches that you can take to normative ethical theories, but the latter, this one here, the spotlight approach, is the one where you can take all of these different theories, all these different things that we can, that you've learned about now, probably a lot of things that feel pretty intuitive and familiar, like having a good character, being a good person, and bearing these different normative theories in mind. I'm hoping the next step that we're going to take, where we're going to be going, is you can utilize that background knowledge to spotlight, highlight different aspects of a problem, some kind of moral issue, in order to fully understand the options, fully understand what's going on here. So what I would like to encourage everybody to do is pretty much anywhere you sort of like something flashes your mind about, say, like the ethics of relationship, for example, or the ethics of virtue. While we're talking about different things today, like, oh yeah, I vaguely remember, wasn't there, you know, some theory that we were learning about that said, it was really important to like care for your community. And if that, you know, feels relevant to you, like hold on to that, mark that down. Think about where, you know, that idea, that sort of like connection popped up in your mind. And that's something that you can return to later and look at and be like, hey, you know, like could the ethics of relationship sort of like help spotlight, highlight, explain some kind of issue that's going on here with oppression, sort of spotlight some harm or wrong that maybe is done in some oppressive social practice or something like this. So essentially, we're going to be from here on out really focusing on utilizing the different tools, these different tools that we've gathered from learning about these different normative ethical theories to spotlight certain issues that come up in the topics we're going to be discussing in the module periods throughout the rest of the class. And we're going to be using those tools to sort of spell out maybe some ethical implications. Maybe we use that to explain why some kind of practice is wrong or harmful. Or we might use some of those tools to just better explain, you know, what's going on in the situation, or perhaps use those tools to certain ethical obligations that we might have. Okay, so does anybody have any questions on that? Any questions about, like, maybe perhaps if you would like me to explain again, like the idea of these different ethical theories being tools, or you know, like if you're still not feeling clear on what this idea of spotlighting is. Okay.
Professor.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Is Hayden?
Yes. So spotlighting is pretty much like taking different from the stuff that you taught, instead of like just taking one, like the Kant and all of that, just taking one theory, we like kind of mix it up.
Yeah, like mix and match. This is what, maybe that would have been the better analogy to use, is like, yeah, this is about mixing and matching to spell out ethical implications, maybe some ethical obligations, or perhaps just you know, better understanding and evaluating some kind of ethical moral issue.
Okay, so this won't be so hard for me, because all right, that's cool, because I'm all over the place anyway.
That won't be so hard for you?
Yeah, it won't, because it's easy to like mix, match, and go all over the place.
Yeah, totally. This is great for this is great for people that like myself, definitely, where I'm like, oh yeah, I heard this idea somewhere over here, and like that feels right here. Okay, I want to spell that out a little bit. And it's definitely not that like you know, no, you have to apply this perfectly and exactly in this precise way that is consistent with the rest of someone's theory. So, I think that a lot of, I know based off of what I'm seeing on the midterms, like a lot of you really took to heart the notes that I gave you specific, like especially on the module 3 worksheet. And like, I was very detailed there. Like I was being like, no, you have to be like, really like, what about this other thing that this person says and that sort of thing. Now that you've like, hopefully my aim there is trying to, as quickly as possible, give you a very broad understanding of some very complex ethical theories. And now, hopefully, with that broader context in mind, you can start just like throwing that stuff in there, taking the bits that you found useful that really like resonated with you, and things like that. So yeah, just to reiterate this point about spotlighting, what we're doing is we're taking different aspects, maybe like different take-home lessons or different maybe we'll call it like ethical logic, right, from different theories, and then using those as sort of a starting point or a starting premise in an argument, if you will, to point to something, like making an argument saying like, well, people have a moral obligation to actively resist social practices that marginalize people, for instance. So thinking about like, well, okay, like what's wrong with something like marginalization. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then sort of, taking a breath, closing your eyes, thinking for a minute, going like, oh, was there an ethical theory that kind of like pointed to how thought about this kind of issue, thought about, these things, these issues that I'm seeing within marginalization. And then if you can identify one, then going, okay, like I can use that as a starting point for saying like, this is why marginalization is bad, or this is why people have a moral obligation to resist participating in marginalizing social practices. Yeah, I got Denise in the chat box. You said that you wanted me to explain spotlighting again. Does this feel clearer to you now? Great, wonderful. All right. So now that we have talked about a little bit about where we've been and where we're going, we are going to move on to this subject on or of oppression. Okay. So in the paper that you read, there were some basic background things that about oppression that, or rather, let me start this again. So in the paper that you read, Young mentions this thing in the beginning, like, okay, so roughly, generally, we have a pretty simple definition for what oppression is. It is a very, very complicated thing, but I think one way she describes it is it works like it's really a family of concepts that share one main thing, and that main thing is that all these different concepts are concepts that involve some kind of constraint on action. So like, yes, we can give you a definition for what oppression is, but essentially we can't be super specific about it because it is so varied in how it manifests in all of its different forms and the different kinds of experiences of oppression that people have. And so the first main feature of oppression there is that yes, it's something, we're not going to be specific about that yet. It's something that involves constraining actions. And it is the actions, not really of individuals. I mean, technically it manifests in individual instances, but of entire social groups. So the beginning of the reading like goes in this big long thing about what all these social groups are. And this was kind of legwork that Jung had to do in response to a bunch of philosophy that had been written on the subject. And as she noted, really, I mean, the paper was published in the early 70s, and she'd been doing a lot of work on it prior to that. So like in the 70s at that point, it's a little bit different in philosophy now. But there was just this kind of like dismissive attitude towards really taking seriously the idea of different social groups. So Michelle, I'm so glad you asked a question in the chat box. That's great. So part of the problem in I mean, I understand what Michelle is asking about. So Michelle asked, what does this mean to constrain something? And I think that is such a great way to approach this, because part of what Jung is saying in the beginning here is that we are talking about a bunch of different stuff. There are a bunch of different ways to constrain something, right? Like I can constrain my arm, prevent it from moving here, but you can also constrain someone by threatening them. You don't have to actually touch them. You can just threaten them saying, if you tell this person, right? That's how blackmailing works. If you tell these people this secret about me, I'm going to tell them this secret about you. That constrains them because then they don't tell that secret about you, right? That's what blackmailing is. You can also constrain people by depriving them of certain things, right? If you in a lot of places, even though you have to get a number of DUIs to get your license taken away, all of the court fees and the cost of having a lawyer and other aspects of essentially how the judge decides to rule in your case can really undermine your ability to keep using your car, right? If you don't have enough money for the gas and the insurance, then you can't use it anyway. And if you had to spend all your money going to court and all of that stuff, that can end up constraining your actions too. So we can go from something as simple to these really complicated ways in which different kinds of ways in which our society is structured. So the way our judicial system works, that could end up really taking away, not even by a direct ruling, but all these different other things going on, like not having money, can take away somebody's ability to drive. That constrains their actions as well. So for right now, the thing that we want to just do as best we can is to keep as broad an understanding of these terms as possible, including what different social groups are. So generally, just by a social group, we're going to be thinking about things like shared experiences, perhaps certain ways in which there are social groups where people identify with that group because of shared experiences, maybe connected to the way they look, the languages they speak, where they live, even the kind of food that they eat, that sort of thing. And then also how certain people are seen by others who don't belong to their group. So sometimes you're going to develop practices like negative stereotyping, for instance, that could end up putting people in a group together. So it's how the outside sees you as well as how you see yourself. And then all of a sudden we get a bunch of different groups that people belong to. And those groups are, or rather like belonging to that group, it's not as if it's a community, right? Because it's like a community is more like people know each other and all that sort of thing. It's more, yeah, it's like specifically like a group. And in belonging to that group, that's like that forms one identity that a person has, right? So, and essentially all of us hold a bunch of different identities. Like we hold different identities just via family relation. If you have like a parent in your life and then a sibling as well, right? Like, so you have both an identity as a child and as a sibling. We also sometimes, depending on the kinds of jobs that we do, religion, languages that we speak, places where we live, right? Like all of those different groups that you belong to by virtue of those connections, like give rise to individual identities in ourselves. And it's those people that hold some kind of identity where oppression targets the people that have those identities in a way, some kind of way, that constrains what they can do. So, I think that everybody's here is probably like very familiar with, I mean, I know because I think everybody has like talked about this to some extent at some point, where, people who experience racism, right? So like by virtue of someone's identity, belonging to being a member of a certain race and then experiencing some kind of constraint on action by virtue of that identity. And a really important point that Frye makes is that, although relations of dominant, like dominant groups and oppressed groups exist, it's not necessary that you to have a dominant group in order for a particular group to be oppressed. Like that is putting too many details into this. Like oppression, again, is something, it's so varied. And so many, it pops up and people experience it in so many different ways. That's too much of a that only captures some forms, instances, experiences of oppression to like really be focusing on like the stuff that the dominant group does, to say that like that's sort of like inherent to what oppression is. It pops up in some ways. It's definitely there in at least one of the faces, several of the faces that we're going to be looking at, but it's not necessarily the focus. Something that is present across the board when it comes to oppression, though, is that there are certain groups that are privileged by contrast. So something about being a member, or rather the existence of certain oppressed groups. It's something that we recognize by virtue of contrasting those groups to another group that does not experience those constraints. So it's a deprivation of an ability to act because of someone's identity that other people who don't have those identities or that identity don't experience. So say because of someone's skin color, they're unable to take certain actions, right? Whereas somebody with a different skin color, normally white or fairer skin, right, has a lot more freedom in their actions. So that isn't necessarily to say that, in every single aspect of oppression, you have like this dominant group that's actively oppressing. In certain instances, certain aspects of oppression, it's important to pay attention to that. It's important to pay attention to this, or rather recognize like there's a dominant group that's doing things, but it isn't necessarily to say that, for instance, like all white people are like actively, like racist, for example. Like, I think that when we're going to be talking a little bit about how mischaracterizations of racism, claims like, like if you think about systemic racism in this country, how that ultimately is a claim that like all white people are, like doing these evil, horrible things, and they're all like out there with like saying these like really racist things, right? Like, that's not an accurate way to describe the situation. It's not as if, like people are explicitly out there, like, trying to like maintain like these structural issues. And again, yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit of how even that framing functions as a face of oppression. So the basic idea is here is we just have these social groups, and those social groups are oppressed in some kind of way that ends up constraining their actions, the kinds of things that they can do. And there are other groups that don't. So there are groups that don't share in that identity that are privileged by contrast. Okay, so the other really big piece here is this piece about these practices, these oppressive practices being systemic. So one way to understand what this word systemic means is by first understanding what it doesn't mean. All right. So what it doesn't, or when we're talking about oppression and we're talking about like the way that oppression manifests in society, namely like these kinds of rituals or social practices that serve to oppress people, Jung argues that, or rather, there's a contemporary of Marion Young's, Marilyn Frye, and Jung talks about Frye in her paper. But this general point that oppression needs to be understood systemically, because we can't see the meanings of these rituals, i.e. like oppressive social practices, if one's focus is riveted upon the individual event in its particularity, including the particularity of the individual man's present conscious intentions and motives and the individual woman's conscious perception of the event in the moment. If we do that, we fail to see the various elements of the situation as systemically related to one in larger schemes. So there, I apologize. I realized we should maybe like rewind a little bit. So we need to be thinking about this in a systemic way. And to understand what this word systemic means, I'm first gonna talk about how it doesn't help to look at something as like this individual sort of like one-off instance of something bad that happened. Okay, so the example would be a situation where we have some kind of, you can imagine like a number of different scenarios where there's like sexual harassment happening, right? Like in like, say like in the workplace, right? And in that kind of situation, what we often find are, like maybe like some comments about like appearance, some perhaps like unwanted flirting or touching or something like this. And a woman, or like and say like this is a dynamic between a man and a woman, and like the woman who's experiencing it is like feeling like, I don't really feel like I can like get out of this situation, like if this person who's harassing her is her boss, right? And so she like knows that something kind of messed up is happening here, but doesn't really feel comfortable calling it out and being like, hey, can you actually stop doing that? And as a result, ends up feeling not really comfortable at work. And then we can imagine a bunch of different ways that that plays out. Like maybe like she continues to stay at work and then the harassment amps up. And then, it gets to the point where like she ends up getting blamed for like her boss, like trying to make a move on her or something like that. Right. Like she was like, well, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stand up and say like, that's not an okay way to treat me. Right. Or like maybe she quits, loses her income that she was making off that job, this sort of thing. And the point that Frye is making here is that we can't understand all of these different, like you'd look so much prettier if you smile, and like maybe like touching like her waist and like hugging her and that sort of thing, like these kind of rituals, like unwanted touching, that sort of thing, like these kinds of practices where it's permissible for say like a guy who's a woman's boss to behave in that way. We can't, what Frye is arguing is we can't understand that kind of behavior if we're just focused on this one instance of the guy doing that stuff. It's the fact that what makes it hard to call out is that it's considered generally permissible behavior. It's not like, say like grabbing somebody and, assaulting them, like committing an act of sexual violence. Like that's something that for the most part, at least like in the United States and really in most places, like that's going to be considered pretty egregious behavior. But there's all these other little things that are considered okay enough to where the person who's experiencing them, who's hurt by them, doesn't really have a strong foothold in order to call out that kind of behavior and say like, hey, stop. So what Frye is arguing here in this point about like, we don't want to focus on just like this single instance where this guy is like doing all of these little things that are like harmful and upset for this woman who works for him. We need to be thinking about, and we don't want to just focus on like her individual feelings about how it made her uncomfortable, that sort of thing. What we need to be doing is zooming out and looking at the different things that facilitate this pattern in these kinds of dynamics. Like sexual harassment in the workplace is a very common thing. Or rather, sexual harassment between men and women in the workplace is a very common thing. There's definitely other forms of sexual harassment that are common as well. But for the sake of this example, like if we zoom in and just look at these individual details, what we miss, you can kind of think of it as like, is the whole forest, right? So like, for those of you who have like heard the saying like trying to see the trees through the forest, right? So like we could look at a forest and we could look at the individual trees and we could zoom out and we could look at the whole forest. And what Frye is arguing here is that we are not going to understand oppression by zooming in and looking at the individual trees. We have to see it on a systemic level, which means zooming out and looking at the whole forest. Okay. Yeah, I know I kind of started off on a little bit of a rough foot with explaining that because I hopped into the quote without giving it. I forgot to give it context. My apologies. And just as a reminder, because we record these lectures, you can definitely go back and review this a little bit. But for now, does anybody have like any questions about? Okay, Kaden, can you tell me like what is it? Explain.
Just the tree part. You kind of lost me on the tree part.
Okay. So
Sorry.
That was just an analogy that I was using to kind of try to explain what I'm talking about here in another way. So the analogy that I was making is that if we look at these individual instances, say of like sexual harassment between men and women in the workplace, if we look at like these little individual instances, that's like looking at the individual trees. And what Frye is arguing is that in order for us to really even understand those individual instances, we have to see the whole forest. We have to understand what's happening on a systemic level that makes it permissible for that guy to be doing those things in the first place. Does that help, Kaden? Or do you want me to try it again?
No, that was good. Thank you. I got it.
Yeah. Like there's something happening on a much bigger level that facilitates these individual instances of experiences of oppression, or individual instances of oppression. Now I completely understand if somebody would like me to try to explain this same concept over again, or maybe perhaps like if you feel murky on the details of the example that I gave here about the sexual harassment stuff.
Professor, one quick, so I think when you mentioned the example you gave is on sexual harassment. So with this argument, we are looking at sexual harassment, not just between men, but looking at it on a broader, from a broader spectrum, like why this is happening.
Yeah.
Why has it become kind of acceptable? Like people feel like they have, they can just engage in such acts and get away with it.
And I mean, I think part of the point here is like, it's not like people, I think, people that are the ones like the boss. It's not like all the bosses that have done this stuff. It's not like they're sitting there going, "Mwahaha, I get to just like do these horrible things to women." It's that like maybe they don't even fully realize like the things that they are doing that are kind of like in their mind testing the waters to see if there's like the potential for some kind of like sexual relationship with that person. It's like because they just like they're allowed to do certain things like in their mind, like, well, it's fine to like tell a woman that like she looks really pretty in that dress, or that like, or you know, like, wow, you really like must make the boys go wild. Like these kind of sexual things, like people don't always fully realize when they're testing.
I think people say some of these you are in the presence of certain, and then they are not even aware that some of the things they say connotes sexual harassment. So
Yeah.
I understand now. It's clear now.
Yeah. And so, and that's this point here about like, we don't want to focus on like the present conscious intentions of this person doing this bad thing to another person. A lot of people, when they do things, when they participate in some kind of oppressive practice, the first thing that they jump to is go, well, I didn't intend to hurt you. You know, I didn't intend to make you uncomfortable, that sort of thing. And not just with sexual harassment, right? Like we see this oftentimes, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit later. We see this when white people are called out for some kind of like some form of racism that they're exhibiting, right? Like, it's like, well, I didn't, you know, like when I was like mimicking this kind of accent, like I didn't think it would be like offensive to you or something like this. And it's like, well, no, the point isn't your intentions. The point is like that we have these broader, bigger problems, and that kind of behavior is something that continues to support these structural systemic forms of oppression. And Shaneely brings up an excellent point about how these kinds of practices, like we're socialized, a lot of us, in a lot of different ways, are socialized to like find those kinds of practices acceptable. They kind of like they exist in the background. So calling them out can be really scary, especially if you're already someone who's a little bit vulnerable because of your identity, right? Like if you don't have a lot of social power or something like this. So I'm gonna skip the next slide for the sake of time. And we're gonna just hop right into Iris Marion Young's paper on the 5 faces of oppression. So like I've talked about, you know, she starts off being like, all right, like got this definition, this general definition, very loosely, right? Like there's not a lot of text here. This is pretty simple definition. We got that. Now let's give a little bit more of a thorough conceptual analysis of it. And looking at it on the systemic level, and thinking about how it involves entire social groups as opposed to like individual instances of harm. And then, you know, when we see the variation in all these different groups, not even to mention, she doesn't use the word intersection, like intersecting identities specifically, but she definitely talks about that concept in general. Like sometimes you have like multiple intersecting identities that give rise to unique experiences of oppression, or perhaps unique experiences of privilege as well. Just like because we have so many different identities bottled up inside of ourselves, right? Like I was mentioning a little bit ago, there's going to be a lot of different ways that that oppression can manifest itself. Essentially, there's a lot of variation there. There's a lot of different ways to constrain someone's action. And what Young's paper does is says, okay, so like I can identify at least these 5 different faces of oppression, like different, and those different faces being the different ways that oppressive social practices manifest themselves. Okay. The first one she talks about is exploitation. And I spent a lot of time on the internet trying to find like good images to help like really capture what the concept is. Unfortunately, this was the best one I could find. But the basic idea of exploitation is that it is some kind of process where you transfer sort of the fruits of a group's labor, so an oppressed group's labor, to benefit another group. So this image here of, you know, throwing a bunch of workers in a meat grinder to just churn out the money, right? I think we see it like this is unfortunately, like this is a pretty accurate way to characterize what Amazon does to its workers. What a lot of big box stores do to their workers, like in particular, Walmart's business model, sort of hinges on they have like this practice of making sure that across the board, all employees, or not all employees, but most employees work just under full time. So the company is not on the hook to pay them benefits. And that provides people in the areas where like they need the employees, right, with just enough money in combination with government assistance, right? So it keeps people at wages that are low enough to where they'll still qualify for government assistance. And those two things in combination together make it so Walmart can pay the absolute like minimum amount of hourly without having to compensate workers in any other form. So in that instance, it's like a pretty extreme example of how they really can just like keep people at this point where the job is just enough in combination with government assistance that gives people enough to where they can scrape by and keep showing up to work. So they're really extracting that labor there, like essentially giving people enough to like keep them alive in order to get the biggest bang for Walmart's buck on that, right? Like they get like a double boom from it because they can rely on government assistance to like give those extra food stamps, maybe like supplement some of like the cost of housing, that sort of thing, in order to like keep people essentially healthy enough to continue working at Walmart stores. Like it's a pretty egregious, it's an kind of an extreme example, but like that's a classic example of exploitation, where like they're really getting people to just like work a bunch and take all of there's no room for upward mobility there, right? Like it's just like it's paycheck to paycheck. Whereas, you have like the CEOs of Walmart that are really like living in the top like 0.1% of the like in the US. So another very commonplace that we see exploitation happen. Oh, I did not realize. Is in the workplace involving just like how I think let me see, how am I gonna lead into this? It's much easier to exploit a group that is perhaps like a little bit more vulnerable, right? Like, especially like people like that really need the money. Like, it's like, I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with, at least if you haven't experienced somebody, at least one example where somebody is getting taken advantage of at work. Like, that's a really common way that we describe this word, exploitation. Yeah, Victoria.
I just noticed you're not sharing your screen.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is, I don't know, actually in the chat box, I'm curious, yes or no, have you heard of the song? I don't expect very many yeses, I just wanna be clear. Have you heard of the song by Dolly Parton, 9 to 5? Yes or no? No. Yeah, no. So that song was actually written for a movie that I have watched recently, and because I'm using it for an example in a paper that I'm writing. But I am shocked by how well this movie has stood up. But this is the opening credits for the movie it's essentially a music video for that song, 9 to 5. So the song was written for this movie, also called 9 to 5. If you have Disney Plus, you can watch it. Probably find it somewhere else on the internet too. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna watch the video. And then I have some of the lyrics up here on the PowerPoint, and you're gonna do a little written reflection on exploitation. Okay, so I am going to have to pause the recording because if I include the video in the recording, I won't be able to, it's a whole mess. So I'm gonna just pause that and then we'll watch the video and I'll start the recording again. On the PowerPoint here, so in case it was cutting out a little bit. So now what we're gonna do is I've posted a document on Blackboard under module period 4. It has this date on it. It's in class writing reflection in the place of the quiz. I also have this the first question down here at the bottom. So if you want to go to the document, open it. I'm going to give everybody 5 minutes to just write down some of your thoughts about what that song in particular, like some of these lyrics here, have to do with this concept of exploitation. So do I have any questions about this?
Yes, Professor, I'm sorry. Are we doing the one you posted on Blackboard, or are we just answering this one question down there?
So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going, as I'm talking through each of these concepts, essentially what I have some questions, like reflection questions for you to respond to after I talk about each one of these faces of oppression. So you're just doing this first one here, but then I'm going to talk about marginalization. So then you're going to do the like questions 2 and 3 or whatever. Does that make sense?
Oh,
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so we're just gonna be going one at a time.
Professor,
Yeah.
that's, why do the lyrics in the song, or what do the lyrics in the song?
Oh, what? Oh, I deleted that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. All right. So nobody has any more questions? Great. So 10, 12. So at 10, 12, we're gonna move on to the next question.
I'm sorry for annoying you. This has to do with, this is on this is on Blackboard, right?
Yes. Or if you have trouble accessing Blackboard, I also put the questions down here, and you can just you could like do them by hand if you wanted, and then like type it up later or whatever.
All right, thank you.
And yeah, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to text me or to write in the chat box. I want to give everybody some quiet time to finish up their answers. Okay. Now, we're gonna move on. And if you didn't get all of your answers, or if you didn't like totally complete your answer, don't worry about it. Just again, this is like one of those things where I want you to just reflect on it a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be totally accurate. This also should be a document that you can help use to sort of like anchor your understanding in things, to answer your to answer questions that'll come up on the module worksheet. Okay. So the next phase of oppression that we are going to talk about is marginalization. So the way that Young defines marginalization is it's a whole category of people that's expelled from useful participation in social life and thus potentially subjected to several material deprivation, to severe material deprivation, and even sometimes extermination, as in death. So this can manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. Oftentimes it's by denying groups the ability to really voice their experiences of oppression. Like there's different ways that, certain groups are treated or regarded, where when they try to say, every time I go to the doctor, like we see these patterns, right? Those patterns are really important. The patterns reflect like that forest, the zooming out bit, or we see these patterns in the way that maybe doctors respond to certain groups. So this is something that we see, like the way that healthcare providers respond to how women report certain physical things going on with their body, how Black people and then specifically like how Black women are treated, how they're what we might call their testimony, sort of like their descriptions of like different symptoms that they're experiencing, how oftentimes like reports of like, oh yeah, this is like a painful thing for me, something like this. Like a physical pain that I'm experiencing, the way that a doctor responds to that, oftentimes, like we see like across the board, these patterns of, treating pain or diagnosing the source of pain differs depending on the person's like gender and their race and things like this. And when that group tries to come forward and say, hey, we have this pretty big problem in healthcare and how like healthcare providers are treating groups of people, those voices oftentimes are marginalized in the sense that they're not treated seriously. They're not taken as seriously. And had they been taken seriously, then there would be more opportunity for some kind of reform. Can anybody think of another example where like there's a group of people saying like, hey, this bad thing is happening to us, there's a pattern of this bad thing happening to us. We need some social change here.
What issues that affect the immigrant be an example?
Yeah, do you have a little bit more details? There's a bunch, definitely.
Yeah, it's like we'll talk about healthcare, even education, and just fair distribution of not wealth, but fair distribution of resources. We see,
I think that's really like,
are constantly being marginalized and relegated to the back.
They're not like their voices are not being taken seriously. Laisa brings up lower income, and sometimes that is connected to different minority groups. For example, like Kaden just brought up, like people with disability, we see a pattern of people with different disabilities oftentimes like making a lot less money. And then when these like these problems that are indicative of some kind of structural problem in how a group is being treated, people try to bring them to the forefront. like Victoria was just saying, when people try to bring them to the forefront, they get pushed to the back, they get ignored, they're not addressed, like all this like pain and suffering, depriving people of certain like goods and services, not even just money. And sometimes, like Young mentions, that deprivation is so extreme that it ends up with people dying. Like we see these different kinds of income disparities, right? Like people not having enough money to pay for emergency healthcare related issues, right? And then as a result, if they don't like have the money to pay for like the procedure or the medication, sometimes ignoring the problem gets so bad that people actually do end up dying. So that is in essence like what we're talking about when it comes to marginalizing groups. And so in this next question that you're going to be thinking about, you're going to want to try to come up with an example, maybe one that just got brought up in the chat box or like in conversation just now. And then just trying to think about what some of the potential causes of that specific form of marginalization there are. So I'm going to give you again another 5 minutes to kind of reflect on that question. So at 10:23, we're going to be coming back. Okay. All right. Yeah. So again, just to reiterate, if you didn't get all of the things that you wanted down on paper, don't worry. You can have until midnight to submit this if you wanted to tidy it up. But also it's just, this is like the purpose of this is just getting some of your own thoughts down, giving you a minute to reflect on the idea before moving on to the next. Before we move on to the next, though, I do want to mention Shanili made this really excellent, and this is a great example. I think it's in the chat box here. If you want to take a look at that, it's not only an excellent example of an instance of marginalizing a number of different social groups, but also how marginalization can work in tandem with exploitation. And as we're going to see, a lot of the time, like different faces of oppression or different aspects of oppression, because they all involve like some kind of social practices, like or norms or things like this. They can like work in tandem with one another. And we definitely see this in just our prison system in the United States. That's a clear-cut example of marginalization, and we know exactly how that marginalization works. Oftentimes it's the thought or the response is like, well, if you didn't want to be in prison, then you shouldn't have done something wrong, right? Neglecting to acknowledge the fact that over 40% of the prison population has not been charged with any crime just because of the way that bail works in this country. Huge portion of the prison population actually hasn't even been found guilty of doing anything. But even that 60% that was, simply because someone is in prison doesn't entail that, like they have signed away all their rights to essentially being able to get used for free labor. So we see like voices are marginalized when people are trying to raise concerns like, wow, these like abhorrent prison conditions. I'm sure, all of you are like in very close proximity to Rikers, right? Which is notoriously one of the worst state prisons in the country. Getting any real attention paid to what's happening there, it's a really difficult task to do. And then in the midst of all of that, you have like these jobs that prisoners are pretty much like forced to take on, where they're making like literally like a couple of cents an hour to produce things, to make anything from like a food product like cheese. License plates is a common one that we know about, right? But clothing, toothpaste, like there's a bunch of different stuff that comes out of prison labor, because those kinds of their treatment is marginalized, right? Like that group is ripe for exploitation, really putting them into that meat grinder, getting all that free labor, being able to extract all that free labor by making sure that people don't pay attention to what's happening for that group. All right. So yeah, that's a really great example there. Okay, we do need to move on. The next phase of oppression, and this, I think that the prison example is one that you could easily use as an example for every single phase of oppression. Just being sure that if you do something like that, like you're going to want to focus on specifically, like what identity does the person have? Like, is it connected to race, disability, class, these sorts of things, and bearing in mind that, those different identities can like intersect. And so it doesn't necessarily mean like, well, simply because you're poor, right? Like there's different ways that poor people experience oppression. So the next phase of oppression, the next aspect or way in which oppression manifests itself is through powerlessness. So powerlessness, the powerlessness are situated so that they must take orders and rarely have the right to give them, right? Like this is, I think that, again, like the prison example is a really excellent example of that. And Young argues that the injustices, or rather she explains that the injustices that are associated with powerlessness are inhibition of the development of one's capacities, right? So like that could be something like not being able to go to school, access some kind of education, lack of decision-making power in one's working life, right? Like this was kind of what I was talking about with the Walmart, with people that work for Walmart in certain places. You know, like if that's like the place that's offering the only real job that you can get, right? There's not much of a decision that you can make there. You know, like if this is the only option for having getting some income for yourself, you're not going to have a whole lot of power in making a decision in where you work. Like you have certain things like food and housing and things like that that you need to get for yourself. And if that's the only means, then that's the job that that a lot of people are forced to take. And another injustice associated with powerlessness is exposure to disrespectful treatment because of the status that one occupies. And that this comes up in so many different ways. I think there's again, you know, a lot of different kinds of poor people in the United States, and watching pretty much like any TV show or any movie, like a big Netflix show or like a big blockbuster movie. If you look for it, you will find some kind of example where like poor people are represented in some kind of disrespectful way. I won't fill in too many details there because I think it's like that is a really interesting sort of like piece to look for, because it is so varied in how it pops up. But it's a very common injustice that is associated with putting people in these situations where they can't really exercise full autonomy, right? They don't have a whole lot of freedom to resist any of the things that they're being told to do. It's one thing if you're a kid and you're in a school environment and you have someone there, like a teacher, who's like, it's their job to nurture you, be there for you, help teach you. And, you know, part of that is you know, saying like, well, you know, now is like quiet time, so nobody's allowed to be talking or something like this, or like, you know, you have to like raise your hand if you have a question instead of shouting something out. It's true, you know, younger students in that kind of environment, even in these older students in this kind of environment, don't have a whole lot of freedom to maybe behave in some of the ways that they might like, that, you know, like you're just like inclined to behave. But that is something that comes with in a system of like education, and being like, okay, well, I have to get some of these as a teacher, we have to like get some of these lessons across. So we're going to need some rules for people to abide by, for everybody to get what they're trying to get out of education. There is some, especially in college, since college students make the choice to come to college, there is some freedom and choice being exercised there, where that contrasts a situation where, you know, somebody needs to pay rent and get food on the table, say like for their kids, right? And the only job that is available is like, it's like Walmart or like an Amazon warehouse job, right? Like there's not a whole lot of freedom there. And then as soon as those jobs are taken, like people as those workers are subject oftentimes to like really, really bad working conditions. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the kinds of working conditions that people who work in Amazon warehouses, but also just like these like big fulfillment centers experience, you know, where they're like not allowed to take bathroom breaks and forced to like be on their feet for a really long time, having to like do a lot of things that are very physically taxing on the body and things that in general, you know, like most people would find pretty pretty abhorrent, like rules that people would really want to say, like, that's messed up. It's one thing for a teacher, say, to like come up with a rule and being like, you have to raise your hand before you ask a question. It's a whole different story. We feel a whole different kind of way about a teacher that responds to a student that breaks a rule, screaming at them, like telling them that, there's some kind of like impolite idiot that doesn't know how to like be in a classroom, right? Like that goes beyond it. We don't think that kind of behavior is okay. And that is definitely the kind of behavior that we see in managers and a lot of like Walmarts and a lot of these Amazon warehouses. There's not a whole lot of, and there's not any power that a lot of workers can exercise in saying like, wow, like I was like, treated in this horrible way by my manager. The response to those people is like, well, find a job somewhere else. And if there's no other job available, right? Like you're not really capable of exercising any kind of real freedom there. Okay. Does anybody did anybody immediately think of like another example that they want to share right off the bat? I'm sure someone has thought of an example of another kind of job, right?
It's not an example, but it's is this like when we're talking about powerlessness, are we also thinking about the power that those who have? So it's like it's I've lost my, it's between the haves and the have-nots. Those who have it have power to do whatever they want to do, and those who do not are so powerless.
Yeah, I mean, in the kinds of dynamics I'm talking about, like in the workplace, right? Yeah, there's going to be hierarchies of power. Some people with like more power, and as you move up the hierarchy, perhaps like a little bit more freedom in how you're able to act. And then the lower you are in the hierarchy, the less power you have to fight back and say like, no, these working conditions are not okay. So I do want to respond quickly to this point that Michelle made and then Caden, I'll get to your question, but this point that Michelle made about there being these bad working conditions being hard situations or barriers. I think that's a really, really great way to think about it. So one thing that we often find in oppression or in experiences of oppression are actually what that philosopher, Marilyn Frye, the person who gave the quote about the example I talked about with sexual harassment a little bit ago. One thing that she talks about, people regularly find themselves in situations where they have no good options available to them. It's like these impossible, it's like, well, you speak up against these bad working conditions and you get fired and then you can't pay your rent, or you don't speak up and then you keep doing a job that is like physically and emotionally destroying you, right? Like neither of those are very good options. And this piece about powerlessness is that, you're in this kind of double bind. You're in this situation where no matter what you do, you can't do the thing that is going to be good for you. You don't have any power to do that. And yeah, Victoria, this point you made about the culture of silence, that's an excellent point. That's largely like what my dissertation.
Because if you're not allowed to, you don't have the power to even engage in discourses that pertains to, like even in the workplace, if you don't even have the power to even speak up when you're not being fairly treated, then you are virtually being silenced.
Yep, it's forcing you, it coerces you into a kind of silence. We often think of people being silenced as like the media censoring them or something, like I think when we hear people oftentimes wrong, like incorrectly use this like, but freedom of speech thing, like Elon Musk crying about, like people criticizing him for saying something awful or whatever. Like so often that's where people really think about like, oh, this problem of like, you're silencing these groups, you're not letting them come out and ask these questions about things. When it's like the group, oftentimes the groups like that it had that kind of privilege that are kicking and screaming, like they not only do they have the voice, but they don't even know what it's like to feel that kind of double bind, that wow, no matter what I do here, right, like I'm gonna have to do something that ultimately is ultimately not at all good for me, right? Versus like somebody wanting to say something racist on Twitter, like they could just not say it and it doesn't hurt them, right? Okay, so I would hope that, people are coming up with like some, yes. Okay. So Shanili brought up a point that's connected to this question that Kaden just asked about, like, so powerlessness happens in a working space, but not school. So the only thing I was saying about school is that there are times where school is not inherently, yes, there is a differential in like power dynamics that happen. It is not necessarily one that reflects a face of oppression. That does not mean that school does not sometimes function in a way that does end up manifesting as one of the faces of oppression. And I think this is the point that Shanili is speaking to here. Shanili, would you mind like elaborating on that a little bit? Because I think this is such a great thing to highlight.
Yes. And by the way, I'm sorry, I hadn't heard beforehand when you had said that schools were not a
No, sometimes it's just not inherently, but they definitely do sometimes, which is like what you're speaking to here. That's why I asked you to elaborate.
Well, in my case, I grew up in a very like red line neighborhood. My mom was guided to buy a house in East New York, Brooklyn, which is fine, but I went to schools that were oftentimes like riddled with many issues, overcrowding, teachers that were not representative of us. And as such, they had a lot of prejudices and stereotypes, and we were very criminalized, and we were treated in ways that communicated to us like their ideals, their expectations, which were very few, and that oftentimes, like when you have a teacher that kind of doesn't believe in you off the bat, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed with 40 or something kids in one class, they're having like all these burdens as well. And you have like this whole security system got like policing you all the time. And like even the windows are like guarded with like metal rods. Like all of that, it's kind of communicating to you like who you are in society. And that also can become like a self-fulfilled prophecy. And like in that sense, like I'm not worth college. I can't get into college, or why would I even try to, like I'm not even going to try with the Regents because who cares, or the SATs, because you know what I mean? Because all of these things are constantly telling you, all of these pressures are constantly telling you like, no, you can't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even if someone does end up going to college, just like the sense of like, well, I never get the answer right anyway, so I probably got this wrong. And then feeling frustrated if like you don't get it right off the bat. So like even after crossing like that barrier that you were talking about and like not trying to go to college, making the attempt afterwards, like there's still further, like that is like, it's disempowering to say, like your experiences don't matter, they're not relevant. And then you mix that in with these different ways that instructors enforce rules in the classroom and often adopt these like policing approaches, right? Like people are like severely penalized for things, sometimes like humiliated and punished in front of other people and things like this. Really like being like, if you're casting somebody as the criminal and doing it in front of like a whole group of people, like that's going to have a serious impact on how someone feels. So it not only sort of like gives a sense of powerlessness. I feel like that's what you were describing, like this internal experience. And as you were also describing, there's like these external forces that are actively disempowering. It's like, it's coming from two directions. I think, yeah, that's a really, I'm so glad that you brought that up because school doesn't have to be that way, right? And I think that probably a lot of you are familiar enough with my teaching approach now where I think about stuff like that to some extent. And I try to resist that because again, it doesn't have to be like that. Unfortunately, these kinds of practices, these kinds of behaviors, these ways that teachers are often brought up to like regard students. If you're like put in an environment and all the teachers around you say like at a high school are saying like, oh yeah, these kids are always trying to get one over on you. If you don't like really lay down the law right away, they're just going to completely go off the rails. None of them have like all of these horrible things, oftentimes connected to like negative stereotypes. And the brand new teacher walks in and that's how they see their classroom. You're going to see that kind of disempowering happening inside of classrooms as well. Lehman has a very, CUNY has a fraught relationship with making it self-aware of those kinds of issues. But Lehman in particular has like a really interesting history in trying to combat some of that. And yeah, anybody who's interested in that, feel free to talk to me after class or send me an email and I can, if you don't know about it already, at least like I can like send some really cool stuff your way. There's some very cool things that Lehman did like in the 70s and 80s that were related to trying to address some of these issues. So yeah, that's a really powerlessness, the ways that you can take away power significantly varies. And in particular, when you're doing this, the question on number 4 and thinking about, why power is important and how it's connected to ethics, thinking about the ways that powerlessness constrains what somebody could do, in particular, inhibits their freedom, right? Like prevents them from doing certain things. And we've talked about some ethical theories that take that sort of thing very seriously. So yeah, we're gonna come back at 10:52. Okay. Okay. Now we're gonna be coming back. Moving on to the next phase of oppression that Young talks about, which is, or rather, what she calls cultural imperialism. And she defines cultural imperialism as an experience of how the dominant meanings of a society render particular perspectives of one's own group individual at the same time as they stereotype one's group and mark it out as the other. So this is I think this is a hard concept to wrap your head around initially, at least, because there's kind of like a almost apparent like contradictory claim being made here, where it's like, in a sense, the experiences of a particular group are rendered invisible, while at the same time being made visible by the way that the dominant group sort of like represents this group. And another way to explain this idea, and this is something that Young talked about in the paper, is this is very much what Du Bois is talking about when he talks about double consciousness. Just out of curiosity, how many people, yes or no, have you heard this term double consciousness before? Everyone in the chat box. Yes or no? Have you heard the term double consciousness before? Oh, wow. Okay. I I've taught at Medgar Evers. It seems like I've had a lot of students there that were familiar with that term. It seems like that's like the Du Bois's work is something maybe that is like more part of the core curriculum there. I was genuinely just trying to gauge to see if that was a better way to explain the idea. But the thinking behind both of these concepts is essentially like there's a dominant society that depicts the identities of oppressed groups in a way that really like constrains or limits like what that group can essentially say about themselves. So like Shaneely was bringing up before about how exploitation and marginalization go hand in hand, we see all of the faces of oppression sort of interacting with this other experience of oppression, or playing a role in this other experience of oppression, cultural, that Young is calling cultural imperialism, where it's like, if you sort of like cast, and this is again, another thing that Shaneely was talking about when she was talking about the way that that teachers were like approaching seeing students at her high school, where you know, like seeing them in this really in this particular way, sort of like having this probably different stereotypes, but multiple stereotypes in mind, and then not actually seeing the student, right? So this is what Young and to some extent Du Bois are both talking about when Young in particular is talking about, you know, rendering the group invisible, like who the group actually is, how they identify, right? And not just that, but like individuals within that group totally goes by the wayside. Instead, what you get are these deeply problematic sort of like cookie cutter images of someone simply based on like their identity. And they don't have any freedom to really like break the mold on that. And this term double consciousness is one that Du Bois uses to describe experiences that people have where they see who they are as like people who possess humanity, while simultaneously seeing these deeply problematic cookie cutter images of their identity rendered by the dominant society, that ultimately really ignores or hides, obscures the humanity of the members of these groups. So essentially, like, these cookie cutters are problematic in the way in that they dehumanize. And when someone is aware of both like their humanity and these cookie cutters that dehumanize, it's like they have this double consciousness where like they're seeing the dominant picture as well as like the pictures that are rooted in their own experience, understanding that like what that process of like the dominant society ultimately dehumanizing them by virtue of their membership to a particular group, and having that kind of experience. So that kind of experience is one that really fully captures what Jung is talking about when she talks about cultural imperialism. So these are a lot of abstract concepts. Again, I would like to remind everyone that you are more than welcome to, a little bit after class today, I will be like uploading the video. So if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I don't understand, this is so weird. First of all, the language is really complicated and it takes a minute. Concept itself is pretty complicated, but important. And yeah, you'll be able to like go back and review this in the video. So to sort of like help maybe see things a little bit more clearly, I'm going to talk about an example, and then you'll have a few minutes to write about the question number 5 here. And yeah, so Kaden, you just asked if the PowerPoints are I'll be putting the PowerPoints up after class. So one example that I think probably is familiar to everyone here of cultural imperialism, it concerns the Black Lives Matter protest movement, and this response to that protest movement takes various forms, but it's just roughly something along the lines of like, all lives matter, right? So that kind of response, that like, and it's largely white people that have that response. Actually, let me pause. Does anybody want me to explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about with that example? Or is everybody pretty much familiar? Okay, Michelle, you would like me to explain a little bit more? Okay, so we have Black Lives Matter that addresses a lot of different forms of violence that Black people experience in the United States, but it got most of its momentum in response to, or it really got national attention in the protest that came after the murder of George Floyd, which I'm certain all of you remember that. And as the protest chant was discussed on various like news outlets and stuff like that, there was this rise in this response to it saying like, well, like why, and again, it was like largely white people saying like, why is it Black lives that matter? Everybody's life matters, right? Like, and so what that kind of response reflects is this idea that and it's a common thing that I that I heard growing up. It was like a very common like thing that like white people would say when I was growing up, which is like, oh, I don't see color sort of thing. Like, why does race matter here? Like, why are you, that doesn't seem legitimate. Like ultimately like everybody, we should all like aspire to, everybody being treated equally, and race like really shouldn't matter in this way. What we need to think about actually are just like the fact that all human lives matter, not that just one particular group's life matters. And what that does is it ignores the fact that there are specific groups that have disproportionate experiences of violence, in particular violence committed, like acts of violence committed by the police, right? And that like it's saying like it assumes, yeah, all lives matter, and we have this one particular group. There's at least one particular group here whose lives are being like, we need to remind people on a national level that like their lives matter, because right now their lives are not being treated like they matter as much as other groups, specifically like white people's lives matter. And the thinking there is, or rather the thinking coming from people that are trying to make these claims about all lives matter, that are like bypassing that in that way, is again this idea that like, well, like race shouldn't matter, like I don't see color, that sort of thinking. And a lot of that is like rooted in white people having a really hard time taking responsibility for these sorts of things, for implicit biases and these sorts of things, like white people wanting to like feel comfortable and good about themselves, and then saying like, well, like, because I think that everybody should be treated equally, that's all that you need to do in order to make the world a better place, right? That kind of view is what we might call like a dominant view. It's not to say the majority view, but like a dominant, powerful view to have about how racism is addressed in this country. Well, we need to just assume that everybody is equal. And so we have to ignore all the differences between people in order to like make sure that everything is better. Doing that really bypasses the very real lived experiences of people who are being treated in these with like disproportionate violence, things like this, right? And essentially like what that attitude is pushing is one where is one where it makes it really impossible for a group to say like, hey, this bad thing's happening to me by virtue of like these different kinds of complicated social practices. Like what this kind of dominant view and being like, no, equality means not paying attention, right? We're going to just ignore that stuff. What that does is saying like there still continues to exist very real problems in this society. So that kind of resistance to explicit recognition of all of these different manifestations of racism in the country is one that really silences what the kinds of the experiences of that kind of view. So this kind of like, I don't see color view is one that ultimately silences experiences of oppression. It kind of like lays claim that like, well, by acknowledging those differences, you're also being racist, right? So again, yeah, this is a complicated issue. So what I want to do with this question, which you'll have about 5 minutes to write about, is just kind of like sit on that And just think about it doesn't, so you don't have to think about cultural imperialism, perhaps like as it affects you or anybody you know. You can definitely write about that if that's what you want to do. But just sort of like thinking about how it shows up, like even on just like your social media feed or something you hear about on the news, something like this. Okay. So yeah, this is like the first stab at like trying to wrap your head around like the framing here of like what this specific face of oppression might look like. So yeah, we'll come back at 11:12. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the last face of oppression that Young talks about. And this one is violence. And the important thing to bear in mind about this concept of violence as a face of oppression is that as a face of oppression, we understand it as being systemic because it's directed at members of a whole group. It's directed at entire groups simply because they are members of that group. So like, again, and there's so much over, I think probably at this point, everybody is really seeing like there is so much overlapping between these different faces of oppression, because like I was, saying just a minute ago involving Black Lives Matter, that's also an example that we see here about the oppression that is connected with violence there. So it's not just these individual instances like instances of police being committing acts of violence against certain groups simply by virtue of their membership to those groups, or rather like you might say targeting specific members. It's not these individual instances of this happening. There is something that is happening on a structural level that gives rise to this these huge discrepancies between the groups that experience police violence and the groups and the groups that experience it very rarely. And the issue there when it comes to violence as a face of oppression, it's not the individual instances. Again, what Young is arguing that violence does here is it functions as a very intense threat, like an awareness that one might be vulnerable, subject to more likely to experience violence simply because one is a member of a particular group. And one example that she talks about is just how the different ways in which women regularly feel like are concerned about their safety, right? Like, just having one AirPod in your ear because like you want to be mindful of what's going on around you, maybe like being concerned about how you're dressed and how people are going to respond to that, right? Like those kinds of behaviors are ones that involve violence because it's the threat of violence. It's knowing that, because say like you're a woman that, it's more likely like that you might get hurt for a variety of reasons. And it's that experience, that fear that Young is arguing really functions or manifests as a face of oppression here. So let's see. Yeah, actually, let's see. Would anybody like me to explain this concept of violence again? Are you still you can see the questions that you'll be writing about. So everybody feels like pretty clear. Would anybody like me to explain this difference between systemic violence and individual acts of violence again?
So when we talk about systemic, we are referring to those actions that society has somewhat accepted as a norm. It's like people do it and get away with it, and nothing is being done about it. It's like we hear all these forms of actions, all these things happening to people of color, and then what people make noise about it one day, and that's it. Nothing is said about those issues again. That's what we're talking about, right?
So that's an example.
Okay.
There are, I think maybe one of the hardest things teaching on this subject and then learning, like I have probably just as hard of a time teaching about this subject as, or this particular lecture, like this intro lecture to this subject, is like anybody here who's like struggling to kind of like get it all together. I'm sure there's some of you that like, oh no, this is totally clear. But like, yeah, for those of you who are struggling, I just want you to know I'm struggling right there with you, because there is so much variation here. There's just so much to take into account. Speaking in broad strokes about it is really difficult because there is so much variation. And so sometimes focusing on individual examples, sort of like Victoria was just drawing out, where, part of violence is like really ignoring that the violence is happening, right? Like letting these threats persist and continue. That's a great example of like the manifestation of violence as a face of oppression. More broadly, violence is simply, or rather not simply, but like violence is something that is happening on, there's like a pattern of violence. You might think of it this way. So somebody, you can imagine some identity where that person is like, oh, because I am blank, it means that I am more likely to experience blank kind of violence, right? Like there's so much variation. I'm gonna leave those blanks there, but you can maybe think of some more specific examples on your own. And the point that Young is making about violence as a face of oppression is that you have whole groups of people who have that, who think about those things, that maybe like anticipate, I'm going to be wary when I go to this place or when I'm talking to this kind of person, because these are the kinds of situations where somebody with my identity experiences some form of violence. And as a result, that person feels a little hesitant. They feel a little bit scared, right? And like we were kind of like talking about in the powerlessness example, right? When we were talking about powerlessness, like at a job and that sort of thing, right? Like fear of losing a source of income, having something like that taken away from you. Arguably, we could call that, like your only source of income, taking that away. If you don't play strictly by the rules, that kind of fear a person might feel, that there's a fear of violence, right? Or like being really afraid in the classroom because you have like a bunch of cops on your campus and like bars on the windows and things like this, like being afraid of like facing some kind of very severe and serious punishment for not staying inside the lines, right? Like that is another instance where you have different, and again, there's a lot of different, we're talking about a lot of different identities here, and there's a lot of overlapping identities that happen too. So I know that it makes it more abstract and probably like wordier and harder to understand, but it's important to be really broad here because there is so much variation. But in general, it's like, well, because I'm like this, because I look like me, or I sound like this, or things, something like that. Like, because I am the person that I am, I know that people that are similar to me are regularly experience this kind of violence. So I'm going to be extra wary. I'm going to be extra cautious. I'm going to feel scared, right? If I find myself in certain situations. Does that help clarify things a little bit?
Yeah, for me.
Yeah, Zaquana, I really like that. It's like anxiety invoking situations. Yes, yes. And it's not just the individual situations, it's that when we zoom out and we look at the tree or we look at the forest, right? We see a lot of similar people who are similar, people who we identify with in similar situations, also feeling that exact same anxiety about those exact same situations. That's yeah, thank you, Zaquana. That is a really, yeah, now everybody is like, okay, I'm thank you. I think that's great. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. These anxiety invoking situations. And it's not, it's not because like oh, going to a job interview is scary, right? Like we all have that's anxiety invoking. For some of us, like maybe going to the dentist is scary. That's like, but that's not because of a certain identity we have necessarily. It could be, just to be clear, not necessarily like having that kind of anxiety going into a job interview. It might just be because people have, but if you go in fearing because, say like somebody who like looks like me often like has trouble in these kinds of like interview environments, then we are talking about potentially a face of oppression connected to violence there. Yeah, that's really that's a really, really excellent way to think about it. Well, hopefully, since that maybe clicked in, I know it clicked in some stuff for me. Again, thank you, Zaquana. Sometimes you just need that sentence from another person to like get at the idea and you're like, clarity, I got it. So hopefully some of you who are going like, oh gosh, I'm so zapped, like I can't think about this. Now maybe that clicks some stuff into place. And let's go into these last couple of questions here. We'll come back at 11:26.
It's 11:24. So in 2 minutes?
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh. 11:29. I don't have any air conditioning in this room and I am not good with the heat and my brain is starting to break. We are coming back in 5 minutes at 11:29. Thank you, Victoria. Okay, so we are going to come back now. So one very quick thing that I wanted to emphasize here is like one, and this is going to be important for the stuff that we're doing next week. One general principle that we should draw from all of these, boom, 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 is that it's really important to adopt terminology that someone uses to talk about themselves in referring to that person. Like as best we can, this involves really listening to how people are describing themselves, describing their experiences, and these sorts of things, because and the irony of it is, like in a society that really like values people getting by on merit, right? And merit having to do with like a lot of work and experience, right? And understanding. The irony of like those kinds of values, at least within the United States, is that, the people that oftentimes like are the experts on their experiences of oppression, there's all of these different ways. And again, like we have looked at that those kinds of experiences get marginalized, or people are made powerless in like getting that point across clearly and correctly on a national level, like raising attention to these kinds of issues. So the first step really is like, just even if you feel like you already understand, if like you don't occupy the position, if you don't share in an identity with a person who belong, like if you don't have the identity of someone who belongs to an oppressed group, to like a specific oppressed group, right? Then the first step is like listening, right? And this is where so much of the stuff we were talking about with like the ethical short circuiting, if you remember, like way back when, like people finding ways to like bypass, ignore, like la la la, no, I don't like believe that, whatever. So, avoiding resisting those kinds of tendencies when we're presented with like information about experiences that say we've never had, really paying attention to like how those experiences are being described, how a person is like describing themselves, and using that language as best we can when we're thinking about talking about those kinds of issues. I think just to sort of like touch on, I think a really great example of how that can both be difficult but not impossible is like how different Indigenous people are talked about in the United States. So like we've seen a lot of variation across the years of like this term Indian being used, and then later it was Native American, and now we're seeing like Indigenous more often. And like, I don't know about you, but I've definitely heard people say things like, well, I don't know any other words to use, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, first, do you need to be talking about all of the different Indigenous groups, say in the United States and Canada, for example, or are you actually talking about an issue that involves like a specific Indigenous group, like Lenape, right, in New York? So listening, turning to like the experts that on the people that are experts about that identity, being the people that have those identities, to sort of like shape how we understand, the specific thing that we're talking about. Does anybody have any questions on that point? Nope. Okay. So that's like the big take home. Like if we really want to understand the problems, we have to listen to the people that are experience the severity of those problems. Okay, so I know it's been a really long day. We didn't do a break today. I really want to applaud everybody. I'm sure that you all are like working, you all worked really, really hard on those written assignments. I appreciate everybody staying with me. So the good news is, I guess, that next week, and I'm gonna be posting all of this information again on Blackboard, but we got some changes to the schedule, and we are not going to be meeting in person. And I want to reiterate, I'm going to write down and repost all of this information on Blackboard. So don't feel worried if you're like brain fried and don't exactly get it. So next week, we are not going to be meeting in person. Instead, what we are going to be doing is we're going to be doing asynchronous work. Everybody knows I'm sure COVID, everybody knows what asynchronous versus synchronous. This is synchronous class. We all meet at a certain time and blah, 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 blah. And so what we're going to be doing next week is there's this article that you were assigned to read called What's My Responsibility in Changing the System? And that is starting from this point, and Zhang talks about Young and Marilyn Fry. We also mentioned her a little bit earlier, being like, okay, so now that we got like what oppression is, like who's doing what here? Who has responsibility to do what kind of thing? What does that look like? That's what her paper is all about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be posting just a few reflection questions. They are going to be a little bit, they're going to require probably at least like 4 to 6 sentences. So not exactly the 250 word minimum, but like they're going to be like semi in-depth questions, few in-depth questions about that article. And then I am going to be posting a discussion board question on Blackboard about the MLK reading that you're doing, Letter from Birmingham Jail. I'm assuming probably a lot of you have already read it, but it'll relate to some of what Zhang is talking about. So you're going to be submitting a written reflection assignment on the article by Robin Zhang. And then you're going to be participating in a discussion board. I'm going to give a discussion board question. You'll need to post a response to that question, and then you're going to be required to respond to two other posts by one of your by two of your fellow classmates. Okay, and both of those things will be due on Saturday at midnight. Do I have any questions about that? Feels clear. People are like probably familiar enough with the discussion board questions at this point. Okay, great. Got that unlocked. So I'm going to need to update the syllabus concerning that a little bit. That's like a pretty minor update. And then the following week, we are going to have, and I'll be posting more details about this later, we are going to be having a guest speaker come in, talk about some stuff that we've been doing in this class. And I'll be posting more details about that, not next week, but the following week. So, woohoo, yay. You do have reading assigned for this week. You will not have any, you'll have a whole week to catch up and whatever for the following week. And then it'll just be you'll just have to attend the lecture, and there'll be a little bit of work post the guest lecture on that. So yeah. I'm going to be needing to send some major updates out there. I haven't got all the details totally clearly nailed down quite yet, but I wanted to give everybody who came here today just a little tiny heads up that we're seeing a few changes in the coming weeks.
Well noted.
Okay, wonderful. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for being so awesome and staying with it today. Even if you weren't able to fully pay attention the whole time, I understand. We got through a lot. If you want to polish up some of those answers before you turn in the in-class reflection assignment, you're welcome to. If you want to just turn in what you have, great. Call it a day. Enjoy this hot, personally, I feel disgusting Saturday, but maybe some of you really, really like that humidity. And yeah, I just want to just to reiterate, and if anybody's interested about the Lehman history stuff, email me, or you can stay after class. I can send you some of the material that I have on it. And yeah, so I will not be seeing you next week, but on Wednesday, you'll start to see some of the assignments and stuff you need to do for class this coming Saturday. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, Professor. Bye, everyone.
Bye.